All right, so we are continuing our conversation on the third practice of We Are Church, everyone discipled and disciples. And we want to get a little bit more into the why, and then we're going to get into some practicals on what does this look like within We Are Church. And so, first in Hebrews 10, verse 23, we see it says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." So first, I want to point out the context of this passage is leading towards like as you see the day approaching, right? So Jesus is coming back. Discipleship, as we talk about, as we have this conversation, it's all with the eye towards Jesus is coming back, and he expects us to be obeying him. He expects people who are faithful to what he told us to be doing. And so, in the light of that this is all about Jesus and it's all in anticipation of his return, what should we do? Well, don't neglect gathering together. And that's a passage I hear quoted a lot within like church leader circles. But it's easy to lose the sight of why. Like, why are we supposed to not neglect gathering? And then you back up into the verse right before that, the whole reason for our gathering, or at least one of the main reasons for our gathering, is that we might consider how we can spur one another on towards love and good deeds. So, this word spur could also be translated provoke or stir. It's like a very active word. So, when we gather together, when we are in each other's lives, when we have our functions and our rhythms as a church community, we are called to be stirring, provoking um, each other up towards love and good deeds. And then you kind of drop down like all the more as you see the day drawing near, like we need to be helping each other get ready for his return. And that's so much behind what we're trying to do with discipleship is man, we've a lot of our church culture is just very comfortable with not really knowing what's going on in people's lives, not really speaking into one another's lives, and therefore not being able to stir each other in this sort of way. And so a large part of what we want to get at here in this video is this like we need each other. We need to be stirring each other up in this sort of way. Rob, what else would you add?
Yeah, I was just reading this passage, and I think it communicates also with what you're saying. As we wait for Christ to come, like living in that anticipation, it says in 2 Timothy 3, it says, "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will become lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious, gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power." It goes on, describing like what it looks like in the last days, and so, but Paul goes a little further as he's writing to Timothy. I'll jump down. He says, "Now you have followed my teachings, my conduct, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, my perseverance through persecutions and sufferings, such as happened to me at Antioch." And he's describing, he's saying, you followed me through all this stuff. You've seen all these things. You know how I've been. And you need to find faithful men that you can teach these things to as well. Like that's what it's about. Like we have to prepare ourselves and be ready as the last days, as the day comes that the Lord is coming. This is going to happen. This is the word of God. It's not like we're just going to move into the end and it's just going to be all right. It's going to go from worse to worse. I think it's in Luke 24 where he talks about in the end, like what it's going to be like. And like, man, if we're not preparing ourselves, not just, yes, we want to overcome pornography and all those struggles and all that, but we have to have a different mindset, equipping the saints, being ready. Stuff's going to come. And if we're not strong, how will we stand, And so I think this is part of it. This is kind of like the why and the what, you know. But when I think of very simply, Jesus said so. Jesus said to do this in Matthew 28, the Great Commission. I was teaching on this yesterday. I was talking about that statistic from Barna in 2018 that said 51% of Christians don't know what the Great Commission is. That's a big deal. And then even of those 51% or 49% that do know, um, they're not sure what it is. They just can describe it. You know, like I heard of it. I know it's in the Bible. I know I'm not sure what it actually means, though. And that's a big deal. You know, Jesus put us here. That's Matthew 28 at the end. His last words, he's saying, go and make disciples. This is like last words, right? I would say the last words, if I'm on my saying goodbye to my family, I'll see you on the other side. Last words are going to be very important. They're probably going to be one of the most important things that I got to say to them before I go. And this is Jesus before his ascension. He's saying, go and make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to observe all that I commanded. Just like Paul saying, you've seen everything. You know it. Same thing. Jesus saying, go and do that with others. Don't just get in a holy huddle. Just do yourself. Just don't just grow inward. Focus. Go to the nations. Follow me. Pick up your cross daily. Follow me. Die. Follow me to the cross. Jesus is inviting. 2 Corinthians 5. Let me just read it so I don't miss it. It says, 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, therefore we are ambassadors. We're ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you on the behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. It says God is making an appeal through us as ambassadors to the world to be reconciled to God. That's why. That's why. That's what we're doing. And again, the 2 Timothy passage, just think about the last days. Why is this so important? And I think we talked about this in the last video where it's pretty much optional these days. That's a big problem. So we have to think about these things, and that would just kind of put a fire on us and say, like, man, God said to do this. This is his way.
Yep. Yeah, as you were talking about Matthew 28, it in my mind was taking me back to, we were doing a training with the leadership of a church of, I think it's, 10 or 20,000, some real big, way bigger than our house churches. And we were talking about the discipleship and making disciples and the Great Commission, and the executive pastor goes, man, we did these survey studies in our church, and we are trying to assess different things. One of them, we were trying to assess how many of our people are actually trying to make disciples. And they found through that study that 4% of their people, it was 4 or 5%, I can't remember, but were actually actively trying to make disciples. And there's one, aspect where it's like, okay, like, I guess first point, that's let's, if we were to step back and just think soberly, like, that's crazy. This is the Great Commission. This is something that Jesus, it's kind of like the pinnacle of Matthew's gospel, right? Like, it ends right after that. It was all kind of leading up to this, like, now go. And then you see the book of Acts is them going. And but then there's also to this point of, like, we've become so used to that in the church that I think as leadership in the church, it doesn't even, like, bother us. We don't even bat an eye thinking, like, oh yeah, I mean, just a few out of the church are actually trying to make disciples. That feels very normal, but biblically that shouldn't be. And so, what we want to start doing is look at, okay, so in our practice, we have everyone discipled and disciples. What we'll do is we'll tackle the inward discipled, and then we're going to get to the outward disciples, although there's a lot of overlap for sure. But and when we talk about everybody discipled, very practically within We Are Church, we want to start to get into some practicals. This isn't how everybody needs to do it. We're just trying to start to say some of how we have tended to approach things within We Are Church. For me in the church in San Francisco and now in Cleveland, we have always had discipleship groups. So as somebody comes into the church, um, I'll have a conversation with them and we share about our values, our, vision, practices. But one of the things that I will most consistently bring up is like, hey, and just so you know, one thing that we do is as men, we meet up, once a week, or maybe it's going to be certain rhythms, certain times where it's like every other week. But we are meeting up consistently as men with and really sharing life together. And same with women. And that is just expected. That's what we do in this church. And I found that that's something I've had to really hold the line on and go, um, this is very important. I've even at a certain point said to my church, like, hey, every one of the things that we're doing as far as rhythms in the church are important. But if I had to rank them, like let's just say in some crazy scenario, you had to only pick one gathering to be at. I was like, I would pick the discipleship group for you to be at. As important as Sunday is, and I'm not saying that's We Are Church's official position. I don't even know if it's mine, but I was kind of trying to make a point. This is really important. It is so important that we're meeting up with a few people, and it could be one-on-one as well, but I've just found groups to be very helpful. We're meeting up with a few and really being honest about what's going on in our lives. We're really loving each other. We're confessing sin. We're like really wrestling through the depths of like how our marriages are struggling, or something's going on in our lives that's a heavy burden. We're praying for one another. So important, and yet also so uncommon in the church. And one thing that I've found is it is very easy, as powerful as these groups are, and as much as like the men in my church in San Francisco, I could tell thrived from it. If you remove that leader, they just will just tend to not meet. As like life-giving as it is so easy for those rhythms to just not happen. And so I guess one lesson I've learned is these like that sort of discipleship within the body requires leadership. And one of the most important things of the leadership is just the like sending out the text like, hey, we'll see you guys tonight. We're meeting up. Like just and maybe somebody's like, hey, I can't make it tonight. It's like, all right, but we're still meeting up. And I found if you don't do that, people will tend to go, well, life is busy. And we just it's a little bit inconvenient to leave your house and go meet up with men. And but it's also so life-giving. The other lesson I've learned is usually people coming into the church, initially when they hear me say like, hey, here's what we do. We meet up as men, we meet up as women. There's like a resistance and maybe a struggle with it for like a month or so. But then after a month or two, it becomes a joy. It becomes like there like depth of friendship starts developing, and we start to really experience the joy of what I believe Jesus, created for us in the body. And so, we're planting right now in Cleveland. We're just a month into planting a church here in Cleveland, and I've done the same thing. I'm like, hey, just so you know, here's what we do. And so all of the men have started meeting up, all the women have started meeting up, and we're just creating that rhythm now. So, Rob, could you share some of what you've experienced within We Are Church in regard to like that inward type of discipleship?
Yeah, I feel like Weird Church has really got a lot of different methods when it comes to this. I've been a part of churches that have like discipleship groups. They have maybe five guys or four guys getting together and the women doing the same on a different night and just going deep in one another's lives. Some of the groups will even have like questions that are asked. I think, the group I'm in right now, it's like four questions that are asked, around holiness, around any sin that needs to be confessed, around evangelism, the gospel, and around intimacy with Jesus, like something like that. We ask each other those questions, but we also pray together and just seek the Lord's face and just ask him to give us a word to obey that week. And so we're asking for scripture to come to mind, the Holy Spirit would show. But I've also been part of churches, some of the house churches in We Are Church, where it's one-on-one discipleship, where the pastor and the pastor in training, the pastor disciples the pastor in training and a couple other guys or another guy one-on-one. And so maybe two guys, and then those two guys would invest in two other guys, and it's kind of like trickles down like that. At some point it breaks down. Somebody doesn't have anybody, but they're doing one-on-one, and I really enjoy those because it feels like you get really deep and you get to invite people deeply into life. It's hard for me to say to five guys, come over anytime, you have full access to my life. Here's the keys to my house. Anytime you need anything, I'm here for you anytime. But I can say that to one or two guys, like full access to my life. And, the term life on life discipleship, that's kind of what that is. Like, let's do life together, man. Let's get so close that we'll see all the things that Jesus wants to change in us and the areas he wants to make us more like him and challenge each other. So I really enjoy the one-on-ones. It seems less structured and more like doing life together, but it has its weaknesses as well, because if you're not strong in it, then you don't set times and it just doesn't happen. It's kind of just drift and wow, it's been a month and we haven't met up, we haven't hung out. So there has to be like a chemistry and a commitment to one another and a modeling things that can be passed on simple enough. When it's, kind of just life on life, it's hard to pick up what's supposed to be passed on. Paul in that letter to Timothy was like, you've seen my conduct, you've seen my suffering, you've seen my life. He's pointing to things that he let him see, not so much that I said, here's how you do that, but he let him see that. But he was saying, pass those things on to people, live that way, go against the grain because the world's going one direction and it's going to go worse. But so I've seen those, invest deeply in a few. That's a real good way to go. There's a book that I read a long time ago, and it really just marked me. It's The Master Plan of Evangelism. I think it's Robert Coleman, maybe. Really good book, but it's just highlighting the way of Jesus and how Jesus went deep with the few. Even though he ministered to the masses, he went deep with the few, and he expected that intentional life with these guys would actually transform and change the world, that they would then pass that on to more people. So, very old school, kind of follow the rabbi, deal, but it's good. It was good for me to learn and then to follow and then say, I will go after this person and follow this person because I see Christ in them. So teaching that to people has been really helpful. So those are some of the things that I've learned here and practice and passed on to people.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and what I would add too, so like Rob's talking about, I think our discipleship needs to include one-on-one, like deep relational investment and that sort of like loving relationships. And kind of Rob's making the case for, and there really are two different, or at least what I've seen within We Are Church, two different approaches, like one-on-one or group, right? So he's kind of laying out some cases for the importance of one-on-one. Maybe I could add a little bit more on group and some of the advantages and potentially disadvantages there. So disadvantage, kind of like Rob's talking about, once a group gets a little too big, once it gets to 5 or 6, you start to lose some of the intimacy that can be present in two, so that's one-on-one, or a group of 3 or 4. I think you can still be very intimate there. Other things, kind of like Rob, you were talking about there with the master plan of evangelism. One of the things you see in Jesus is he very often had disciples plural around. He had like a couple different guys around that he like really tended to have a rhythm. It's not to say he didn't have one-on-one conversations at points, but he often had a few different people around. And I think part of what I've practically seen as an advantage is if you're doing one-on-one discipleship and one guy is like inconsistent and not committed to it, it just breaks down completely. But if you have a group of 4 and one guy is being inconsistent, the 3 are still meeting up, and then they're encouraging the one guy like, "Hey, bro, where are you at?" Like basically, come on, you should be getting here. And of course, people can miss. I'm not saying like that, but if somebody just consistently is ducking it, it starts to stand out. I've also seen in a group, one advantage is as somebody's going through something in their life, instead of it just being one person speaking in, they're getting multiple different perspectives. And also, over time now, I have several people who are really aware of what's going on in my life and I've connected with in that sort of way, where sometimes one-on-one, it might just be one person. Although it could be that I'm meeting up with several different people at different times, which would be great. So just some of the different things you can, as people listen to the video, think about like, how do we structure this within our church? Is it like getting everybody meeting out one-on-one? And that's what has happened oftentimes is as a church, very practically, kind of almost like draw it out on a whiteboard and go like, all right, who's with who? So if it's like one-on-one, it's like, all right, he's meeting up with him and she's meeting up with her, and like, okay, we've got everybody covered. And then the key is making sure, how do we make sure people are actually meeting up? And then within the group, it's like, all right, these five will, these four will meet up. But kind of even like Rob's talking about, it shouldn't be that the leader is now discipling every one of those guys. Often how it's been is maybe there's three or four other guys in my group, and I'm really discipling one or two of those guys, and then somebody else in the group is a discipling another guy. And that means if they've got real deep stuff going on in their life, like they're going to meet up at other times. So anyway, just we'll probably get even to a little bit more practicality in the next video. But Rob, maybe you could go a little bit into the outward, right? So everyone disciples. Like, what does that look like? Maybe actually, well, yeah. You go ahead, and then I'll share a few thoughts. So what does that look like within We Are Church? And what advice do you have for leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can share kind of the things that I've learned here, right? Well, actually, when I was in prison and I just barely got came to know the Lord, there was a group of guys in there. It was kind of cheesy, but it was cool. I was brand new, so I didn't know anything. And once a week, they'd go, we're going to go out on the yard. There's about 2,000 people in this prison. It's Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. And they're like, we're going to go out there every Wednesday and we're going to go share the gospel with people and pray for people. And they used to call it the Soul Patrol. It's a funny name, the Soul Patrol. And so I would go with those guys, and I was super embarrassed because I just become a Christian and I was a gang member and walked away from a gang. And so to be standing with these guys while they were doing it was very embarrassing to me, to be honest. But there was like stuff that was just embedded in me and during those times, as I started to be filled with the Spirit and get bold and sharing the gospel and praying for people and seeing God do stuff. It activated something in me early on. Like it was like part of being a Christian. So, and we'd go every week, and we didn't see a lot of conversions, but I seen a lot of faithfulness. And that just put something in me that just has not gone away. And I would say We Are a Church, when I came out, they were very strong in that. Like every week after the gathering, they'd go out as a church family and knock on doors. And I was part of that. And during the week, they'd go to food banks and other places, shelters, and share and serve the gospel. And every week. And I'd be like, wow, this is the same thing they were doing in prison. This must be what Christians do. And, I loved it. And people would come from different places, different churches to join the church that have been Christians for years and had never shared the gospel. And then they start getting activated and living that way. So it was like intentional rhythms, just like there's intentional rhythms to meet up during the week for discipleship and share each other's problems and hangups and all that stuff and talk about Jesus. Same thing. There has to be intentionality, that people would be activated and start learning how to live and walk like Jesus. Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. He didn't say, stay in a little group, hide out, and I'll go fish and you guys stay there. But no matter what, like we're following Jesus, right? So I think the intentional rhythms of going out, whether it's like whatever, wherever it is, farmers markets, it doesn't have to be the homeless camps or anything like that, to just pray for people and share the gospel with people. I think it does something. Yesterday I go into a jail and, man, God just opened a door to go in there every week now. And I'm just seeing amazing stuff. I was sitting with the guy. I got to get some one-on-one time with the guy that's there. He's fighting a murder charge. And I'm talking with him about Jesus. And he's like, man, I've been raised Mormon all my life. And I just give him the truth, the gospel. And he's like, I want that, but I don't know how. And he just gives his life to the Lord right there with a half-hour visit, and I'm like, man, if I don't go out and try and fish and just believe that God wants to do stuff, then this guy doesn't get to give his life to the Lord, So it's like that stuff has to be like embedded or activated, or I don't know what the word is. Like, I believe we are ambassadors, like I said earlier. I believe that. God's grace, he's called us ambassadors, that we get to go out and make an appeal to the world, to be reconciled to God. So I just think every Christian needs to be activated. Finding the evangelist in the group, in your church, your house church, or whatever it is, and really champion those guys. And they're messy and they're not the smartest sometimes, and they're not the most eloquent and most, Bible versed up, but God put a gift in them that's supposed to edify and build up the rest of the body to do these things, So finding those guys is really important for outward focus, because the pastor is usually the guy that's going to want to gather and keep them in and take care of them and nurture them, the sheep. And the evangelist is probably the guy that's kind of like, man, it's getting boring. When are we going to go somewhere? When are we going to do something? And so find that guy and champion that too. Use that gift that the body has from the Lord.
Yeah, I've noticed, yeah, the evangelist uh maybe yeah bored, but also like kind of gets frustrated. I've seen the evangelist get frustrated with like, man, we just keep gathering and like people are doing okay here. Like what about the like their like heart yearns for the person that's like really struggling. And I just share that to add because I think it's important. I would imagine a lot of people watching these videos might be in a pastoral role in some sort of formal leadership in the church. Um, and so often, at least for me, when I hear you talk about like going out with the church and like having vision for that, like I've done that at points, but it also I think goes a little bit against the grain of my instincts as more of like a shepherd teacher. um, and so one thing I've learned is to even within Cleveland, like we're just a month in, but I've already identified three people in the body that I'm like, okay, they have a gifting for evangelism. And that does not mean, okay, so now they're gonna go do it and then we just do our own thing. It's like, no, no, no. I want to start, and I've already started having some conversations with him about like, hey, what can we be doing as a church body? Because what Rob you're talking about, I think a lot of people yearn for that, and they're like, man, yeah, I want to, but I just don't know how, or like, I don't know where to start, or I don't know what to get involved with. And that's where there's certain people in the body that will have vision for it, because God provides different gifts in the body, and we have to rely on each other. We have to look to each other, and so for the pastor listening to this, again, my encouragement would be like, hey, don't feel like this needs to be on you to lead it because pastors tend to be just looked at to lead everything. But at the same time, you do have the responsibility, though, to empower and champion the evangelist or the person that's maybe they're not like a strong evangelist, but they're very oriented to go out and like care for the poor or to get involved with causes that the church can like jump in on and come and support and bring Christ and bring the body to bear in that place. So often it's sad because the evangelist I've seen oftentimes feels kind of like a bit of a misfit in the church, and because they don't quite fit in or they get a little bit frustrated with all the internal. But if the leadership of the church was consciously championing those people and encouraging them and saying, "Hey, we want to go with you," or "Hey, could you take a couple with you?" That would be super helpful. And then another thing I found, it's really important to have rhythms of keeping this conversation top of mind. I know we have a lot of friends and I try to and I struggle to do it well, but they have just every week or every so often a conversation like, "Hey, who are you praying for?" or like, "Who have you been sharing with?" or let's take time to talk about who are people that we're trying to intentionally reach. Who can we be um like who has God put on our hearts? And just to be like praying for those people together or just being able to celebrate attempts at sharing Christ or to be able to go, man, I want to be, really trying to be an intentional with my sister to share with her. And I would appreciate accountability. Like to be able to have those sort of conversations where we are like putting it out there because it's very easy for that outward sort of evangelism to become to like fall on the back burner because it is uncomfortable, like you were talking about, Rob. Um, so I don't know, any other advice or any closing thoughts for this video, Rob?
Yeah, I was thinking about the scripture when we were talking earlier. It's in First Corinthians 3, Paul's talking about division, Apollos and Paul, them being nothing, but Christ being everything. But in First Corinthians 3, 6, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. And so it made me think of this because sometimes, like, we think about just how, if, I mean, we all want to be effective in life, right? But really, it's like God who's going to cause the growth. God is going to save. God is going to, it's all from Him and through Him and to Him be the glory, not us, not that we're great, at anything. It's just, we're just going out in obedience and saying, God, do something, you know, it's your will that none would perish. Like, do something. And then even in the groups, in the houses, like that, we love each other only because He loved us first. And if there's growth there and there's intimacy and humility and just vulnerability, it's because God's opening us up. He's doing the stuff that He said He would do. And the church grows that way, not in numbers, but in depth of relationship. And then when people come and see, they're like blown away how much we love each other. Like, this looks like what I read about. And so just really depending on God and not on yourself, not getting hung up that you're not great or effective in anything. Be obedient. That's what He's called us to, obedience. He's the one that will cause the growth. Anyways, I just felt like sharing that before we close.
Yep. And maybe my last thought would be, I think that is one of the number one reasons I've found and I've experienced in myself why I maybe struggle with sharing the gospel is discouragement, like feeling like, man, the last, however many times I've tried, like people didn't seem interested. But like you're hitting on there, I think it's so important. Like this is for Jesus. This is unto Him. It's not about the results. It's because the king deserves it. He deserves to, I think about like, God to Ezekiel, where He puts him as a watchman. He doesn't promise Ezekiel that people are going to listen, but He says, you need to say it. Like you need to tell them. That's your responsibility. And very few people did listen to Ezekiel. But again, the goal was faithfulness, and God just wanted him to say it. And then my last thought was oftentimes we get the question of, what do you guys do within your discipleship? Like, do you have curriculum? Do you have, different things? And that can vary from group to group or meetup to meetup. But I think the main thing is developing a culture of love, of depth, being honest and transparent about our lives, really loving each other, really caring for one another, really praying with each other and for one another, and then kind of like the curriculum that goes alongside of that, that can be very helpful, but it's not the main thing. And so, just having your mind like the main thing isn't like, okay, we're trying to get people together to like go through this study. The primary thing is to get together to like really deeply love one another. And then this study or this resource could be helpful alongside of that. But let's make sure we're being transparent in our lives, like that we're really being able to like know and care about what's going on in each other's lives. And yeah, I think that's huge. But we'll end it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.